All right, welcome to WSQ number 22. Today we're going to get started and we're going to begin a journey over the next few weeks as we talk about evolution, as we talk about really origins. How did we get here? And we're going to really examine two different perspectives. We're going to examine the naturalistic perspective, first of all, which is commonly, excuse me, the perspective of the world, of unbelievers. And that perspective is that we came from nothing. That we came by strictly natural processes over millions, if not billions of years. And so we're going to talk primarily about evolution, which is related to the biological diversity of organisms that we see around us. And today we're going to start by talking about Charles Darwin, probably the most famous evolutionary scientist that's ever walked the earth and is known as the father of natural selection. The evolutionary theory that posits that all life came from one organism over millions of years and through mutations and changes. So what we'll learn today is we're going to talk about what were the observations Darwin made on his voyage when he went to the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s. How did Darwin account for the diversity of species and the differences between similar species? And how do some say natural selection leads to evolution? We're going to kind of talk through those things. And hopefully by the end you'll have a little bit better understanding. So we have to start by going back into time. We're going to go back to 1831, and then 22-year-old Charles Darwin was on a ship known as the Beagle, and it was sailing from England to the Galapagos Islands. And so we can actually see right here, let me get you. So we can see on our screen right here that here is England. So they took off from England and sailed all the way down to South America, around the tip of South America, all the way back to just south of North America is the Galapagos Islands. And then they traveled on to New Zealand, to Australia, to parts of India, back to South America, and then back up into England. So quite a journey on a ship. Would have been a great adventure and a lot of experiences. But what happened is while on the Beagle and on the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin was led to develop one of the most, and we'll use this, one of the most important scientific theories of all time. That's actually what the textbook calls it. And we're going to talk about it. I would say, yeah, it is a very important scientific theory. And I think we have to be really careful with it because it's a theory that can lead really to determining your understanding of God. And so let's get into it. What did Darwin find? Well, when Darwin got to the Galapagos Islands, he saw a great diversity of organisms. Okay, today scientists have classified over 1.5 million species of organisms on Earth. That's what we know of, and literally on a weekly, if not daily basis, we're finding new species. Parts of South America and in the ocean, there are new insects and fish being discovered. I mean, daily. I think of the great tsunami that hit India and Indonesia about 2005, 2004, and they found like 300 species of fish that were just pulled up from the depths that no man had ever seen. Now, what a species is just a group of similar organisms, okay, that can mate, group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so any organisms that can mate and produce fertile offspring that can reproduce are considered the same species group. Okay. Now, understand too, he not only saw a great diversity of organisms, Darwin also saw fossils. He found fossils of dead organisms, and all a fossil is just preserved remains of an organism or traces of an organism. And so a lot of times we'll see these in dinosaur bones and dinosaur fossils. They can also be at times just the remains of an organism that have been preserved in, let's say, amber. Liquid amber, we see this. If you ever watched Jurassic Park, that's an example. So he saw one, diversity of organisms, a variety of different organisms. Two, he saw fossils. Thirdly, he noticed some characteristics. Down below we have here 3 different organisms that he observed. The Galapagos finches, or known as Darwin's finches, the different turtles, these type of tortoises that he saw on the islands, and this particular type of iguana. And what he noticed is that there were some comparisons, that many of the organisms on the Galapagos Islands were similar, okay, but to the South American organisms that he had seen when they had been traveling towards the Galapagos. But he also saw some differences. For example, the claws of iguanas were different shaped and different size on the Galapagos Islands than they were on the South American mainland. He saw differences even in among the islands. There were differences between organisms on each of the islands that make up the Galapagos Island chain. Okay, for example, there was a difference in tortoise shells. Some tortoise shells were rounded and low to the neck, and then there were some like the one we see below, which were actually raised, these raised bridge, different types of tortoise shells. And then he saw, all of these different finches and saw that there were different traits that had helped the organism survive and reproduce in particular environments. So finches with a very particular beak size or design were able to eat certain fruits or berries, while others could eat, other food products as well based upon their size. So he looked at these characteristics of the organisms of these Galapagos Islands, and it got him thinking. Now, this led to his theory of evolution. Now, his theory of evolution, first of all, you need to understand, evolution is not Darwin's theory. Evolution had been proposed literally for thousands of years. There were Greek thinkers that had thought through this as well. But he reasoned, his thought is that plants and animals on the Galapagos Islands had faced environmental factors that over time gradually led to changes to those species over many generations. So what he did is he took these organisms that were on there and he said, hey, they didn't start like this. There wasn't 4 types of finches way back. There was only one. And what happened is the environment over time would lead to gradual changes to species. They would become something different. Now, I need to understand something right here. That is what we call evolution. And there are 2 types of evolution we're going to talk about: macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution, okay, very different. I would be one of the first ones to say, I believe in microevolution. I am an evolutionist. Now, so wait a second, Mr. Filburn, here's what I mean. There are slight, small changes and adaptations that happen within species groups that allow them to change and adapt to their environment. If I went and lived in the deserts, okay, and there was lots of sun in the desert, over time my skin tone would darken. Now, that's an adaptation. I'm not turning into another organism. That is my body using melanin production in the skin to help defend against illness, disease. So it's my body protecting myself from the damage of sun. That's microevolution. That's a variation. We observe that. That's scientific. That's even scriptural. Okay, there's nothing anti-biblical about changes. We see this in dog breeds. Dogs and roses and other organisms that over periods of time have been bred. We have lots of dogs today that didn't exist hundreds of years ago. They're still dogs and they're still the same species. They haven't changed into something else. Macroevolution on the other side is assumed. Macroevolution, there is no scientific evidence that demonstrates an in-between organism. I love this little drawing right over here. We have millions of monkeys and apes. We have millions of humans, billions, but we don't have millions of these in-between organisms that would have had to have existed to get from here to here. There would have been literally millions of these in-between missing links species that we don't see anywhere, that we don't see happening and existing. So macroevolution is really based on some fallacies, and there is not scientific evidence that supports macroevolution. And really you have to understand that this ultimately, Darwin was looking at this ultimately comes back to a view of how do we get here? And everybody starts with one of 2 things. You either believe that there was a God that created everything out of nothing, or you believe that the universe is eternal. It's existed forever. And that doesn't make much sense when you think about it. We don't see anything in our world that just arises out of nothing. Everything in our world comes from something. It always has a cause. There's causality. And so that's what Darwin reasoned. Okay. Now, Darwin came from a background that kind of pushed them towards this, but he also, when he came back, he looked at selective breeding practices of animal breeders and things like that, and he thought that those displayed support for his evolution by, look at all these dog breeds. But that was microevolution, not macroevolution. Ultimately, this led to the theory that he would come up to known as the theory of natural selection. And what natural selection says, it's basically the process, according to Darwin, by which individuals who are better adapted to their environment are most likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the same species. To what I say, no duh. Right. Organisms that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive. And if they survive, more likely to reproduce. So what Darwin said is, hey, there's all these organisms. The ones that are best prepared and have the best resources to survive will survive, and they'll reproduce. And they'll reproduce organisms like themselves. And he also said, well, and guess what? There's always overproduction. You take the turtles. Turtles produce literally hundreds, if not thousands of eggs. And of those hundreds or thousands of eggs, only a few will survive. Only the strongest will survive, survival of the fittest. So he said, hey, there's going to be overproduction. More offspring will be produced than needed. And there's going to be variation. There's differences in all the different traits of species. So when turtles hatch, there's going to be hundreds of different variations in that one brood of turtles. But what will happen then is there will be competition. There's only limited resources. So organisms are going to compete for those limited resources. And then there's going to be this selection process. Certain variations will lead to better chances of survival in offspring than others. Let's say turtles that are faster are going to be able to outswim, right, the fish. So selection, okay, as though natural selection is an organism or is a god, right, allows those with variations that are, more able to help them survive. Now they're going to survive and have offspring that have the same trait. So ultimately what he proposed, that over a long time, what we see as natural selection doesn't just lead to variation in organisms and species that, have adaptation, but here's the big one, that it would lead to a change in species, that we would have new species. That's macroevolution. And there's no evidence for macroevolution. Yeah, there's things they claim to be evidences, but we see nothing scientifically in the realm of science where we see an organism going from one species to another. Now, ultimately, as he'd say, if they survive, they'd be able to reproduce. I will say this. I believe in natural selection. I think it's very well true. I think God designed in our environment that certain organisms with certain traits are more able to survive. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. But I don't believe it leads to this term right here, macroevolution. I think it leads to microevolution, but not macro. And I believe this for two reasons. One, because the Bible tells us how God created the world. Two, we have no scientific evidence, at least compelling evidence that I can find, that tells me that this is happening today or that it's ever happened in the past. So that's WSQ 22, an introduction to Charles Darwin and to natural selection. We'll be talking a lot more about it in class. Thank you guys, and I will talk to you later.